Picture a queen stopped at an invisible line in the middle of her own capital. It is June of 1977, and Elizabeth II is riding to St Paul's Cathedral to give thanks for 25 years on the throne. She rules over 14 countries. Her face is on the money, and yet at a certain point on a street called the Strand, at a spot marked by a black dragon on a stone pedestal, her carriage slows and stops and waits. A man in a fur-trimmed red gown walks up to the royal carriage. He is carrying a sword whose scabbard is crusted with more than 2,500 pearls. He offers it to the Queen, hilt first. She touches it. Only then does the procession move on, with the pearl sword carried ahead of her, point down, all the way to the cathedral steps. Now, tour guides will tell you that the monarch was asking permission to enter the city, that she could not pass that dragon without the consent of the man in the red gown. And I have to be honest with you right at the start, because this whole story depends on being honest about exactly this kind of thing. That's not quite true. No permission is asked. No permission is granted. What actually happens is a gesture of welcome. The man in red surrendering the city's sword to show loyalty, and the monarch touching it to show trust. The lawyers on both sides agreed on that wording a long time ago, and the lawyers on both sides have been very careful about wording for roughly 900 years. But here is the thing the polite wording is hiding. Ask yourself the only question that matters. Why is there a line at all? Nowhere else in England does the Crown pause at a boundary. The King does not stop at the edge of Manchester. There is no sword ceremony at the gates of Bristol. Only here, on this one street, at this one dragon, does the most powerful person in the kingdom slow down and stop and observe a border that appears on no modern map, as if crossing from one country into another. Because that is exactly what she was doing. The secret sitting in plain sight, the secret this whole story exists to unwrap, is that London is not one city. It never has been. Legally, historically, stubbornly, London is two cities standing shoulder to shoulder and wearing one name like a trench coat. There is the City of London, capital C, 1 square mile of ground in the east, wrapped in the ghost of a Roman wall, with its own government, its own courts, its own police force, and a ruler called the Lord Mayor whose office is older than Parliament. And there is the city of Westminster in the west, the city of the Crown, of the abbey, of the palaces, where the king is crowned and the laws are passed. Everything else, all the London you think of, the tube map, the suburbs, the 8.5 million people, is just the flesh that grew around those two ancient skeletons. And tonight, moving slowly through 2,000 years, we are going to find out why. Why the border exists. Why it survived every king, every fire, every empire, and every committee that ever tried to erase it. Why 1 square mile of England managed to stay, in some strange and technical sense, unconquered. By the end of this story, you will be able to explain it to anyone, in plain words, in about a minute. But we're not going to rush. We're going to walk there, year by year, the way you walk towards sleep. So, I make these history stories, and I genuinely cannot tell anymore whether anyone out there is actually sleeping, or whether you're all just lying in the dark with your eyes closed, secretly hoping to hear about severed heads on a gate and a sword covered in pearls. Either way, you're in the right place tonight, because this story has both. Subscribe if you feel like it. Get comfortable. Here we go. One promise before we start, because this channel runs on trust. Every date in this story is real. Every building, every law, every fire, every king, every gate. The charters I will read to you exist. You can go and see some of them under glass. but history at street level was lived by people whose names nobody wrote down, and so, from time to time, I am going to lend you a pair of eyes, a boatman, a mason, an apprentice. Their streets are real, their prices are real, their weather is real, but the eyes themselves are borrowed, stitched together from records of 100 lives like theirs. That is the deal, and I will always tell you which is which. Where the documents end and the guesswork begins, I will say so. The story starts before either city exists. It starts with a river and 2 pieces of ground about 2 miles apart. Remember that distance. 2 miles. Everything that follows, the sword, the dragon, the queen waiting in her carriage, grows out of those 2 miles of muddy shoreline. It is a morning in late spring, somewhere around the year 50 after Christ, and your hands are bleeding again. Not badly. Just the knuckles, where the rope has taken the skin off, because you've been hauling flat-bottomed barges against the current since first light, and the rope is soaked and stiff with river grit. You're standing thigh-deep in the Thames, and the Thames is cold in a way that gets into the bones of your feet and stays there until nightfall. The water smells of mud and tar and cut oak, and underneath that faintly of the salt sea 30 miles downstream, because this river is tidal, and the tide is the whole reason you are here. You're a Briton, born a day's walk to the north, and you are working for the Romans, not as a slave, as a hired pair of arms paid in coin, which is itself a new and slightly suspicious idea, these little silver discs with the emperor's head on them. The Romans arrived in this valley 7 years ago, in the year 43 by their counting, with 40,000 soldiers, and, more dangerous than the soldiers, with surveyors. Men who look at a wet valley and see lines. And what the surveyors saw here, at this exact bend of the river, was the one thing they needed. The lowest point on the whole Thames where the ground was firm enough on both banks to anchor a bridge and the water still deep enough for a sea-going ship to ride in on the tide. Downstream of here, the banks dissolve into marsh. Upstream, the big ships can't come. Here, and only here, 2 gravel hills rise on the north bank, with a little stream called the Walbrook running between them, and the river narrows to something you can dare to span with timber. So they spanned it. The bridge is why you have work. All day, every day, the materials come. Oak piles cut upstream, iron, roof tile, amphorae of wine and olive oil from a sea you will never look at, stacked in the holds of ships whose sailors speak 6 languages badly. You haul, you carry, you stack. By evening your shoulders feel as if the bones have been replaced with hot sand, and you eat flatbread and river eel by a fire, and around you, in every direction, a town is assembling itself with terrifying speed. They call it Londinium. Nobody's entirely sure even then what the name means. It is probably older than the Romans, some Celtic word that had been attached to the place for centuries. But the town itself is brand new, and this is the strange thing you notice about it, the thing that makes it different from every settlement you've ever known. It was not founded by a king. There is no chief here, no royal hall, no sacred grove. It was founded by traffic, by the bridge and the tide. And when I say founded by traffic, I need you to understand what that means, because it decides everything that happens for the next 2,000 years. Londinium exists to move goods and take a cut. That is its religion, its politics, and its personality. A great Roman historian named Tacitus, writing the first sentence about London that anyone ever wrote, described it as a place famous for its swarm of merchants and its trade. Not for a temple, not for a general, for merchants, Hold on to that. It is the first piece of the answer. Because 2 miles upstream on this same morning there is another place, and the other place is nothing. You have seen it from the water, on the days when work takes you upriver. The Thames swings south in a long lazy curve, the banks flatten out, and on the north side a smaller river, the one later called the Tyburn, comes down from the hills and splits into channels as it meets the tide, braiding around a low hump of gravel and bramble not much bigger than a large field. At high water it is an island. At low water it is a mud flat with an island's ego. Thorns grow on it, which is how it will get its eventual name, Thorny Island, the Isle of Brambles. Herons stalk the shallows. Fishermen work the eel traps, and that is all. No bridge, no quay, no town. Just a dryish hummock in a wet place, 2 miles from the noise and money of Londinium, connected to it by nothing but the brown water sliding past both of them. One day that Bramble Island will hold Westminster Abbey, the Houses of Parliament, and the Tomb of Kings. The 2 miles of riverbank between the island and the bridge will become the most contested strip of ground in English history. But nobody knows that yet, and there is no reason on earth to suspect it. In the year 50, the future capital of Britain is a town at a bridge, and the future seat of its government is a swamp. 2 places, 2 miles apart, one built for money, one fit only for herons. That is where it starts. 10 years later, the town at the bridge burns to the ground, and you can still find the scar. This part is documented brutally well. In the year 60 or 61, a queen of the Iceni tribe named Boudicca, flogged by Roman officials, her daughters assaulted, her kingdom stolen, raised the east of Britain in revolt and came down on the Roman towns like the end of the world. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, rode ahead of his legions to Londinium, looked at the town's low earth banks and its total absence of walls, did the arithmetic of a professional soldier, and made the coldest decision in the city's history. Londinium could not be defended. Londinium would not be defended. He gave the townspeople a choice: march out with the army or stay, and then he marched. Those who stayed, the old, the stubborn, the ones who would not leave their stock and their shops, were still there when Boudicca arrived. She killed everyone she found and burned everything that would take a flame. Tacitus says 70,000 died in the 3 towns she destroyed, and even if that number is a soldier's exaggeration, the layer is not. Today, when builders dig deep enough anywhere in that square mile, they hit it. A stripe of oxidized red ash, about a foot thick in places, sitting in the London clay like a bookmark. Archaeologists call it the Buddhism destruction horizon. Office workers in glass towers eat lunch 100 feet above a line of burnt grain and melted glass, and the carbonized traces of the year the city died for the first time. And here is what matters for our story. Rome rebuilt it. Of course, Rome rebuilt it. The bridge and the tide were still there, and within a generation Londinium was bigger than before, and this time it kept growing until it became the capital of the whole province. They built a forum, the Great Market Square, with a basilica along its northern side, the town hall and law court in one, and this basilica was the largest building of its kind north of the Alps, over 500 feet long, longer than St. Paul's Cathedral is today. Perhaps 30,000 people lived here at the peak, some say more. Bathhouses, temples, an amphitheatre whose curved wall you can still stand beside, in a dark room beneath the Guildhall's art gallery, because a city that would not stop being itself built its town hall centuries later. almost on the same spot without knowing what lay beneath. And then, around the year 200, they built the wall, give or take a couple of decades. The dating rests on coins found in the construction layers, but the wall itself you can touch with your hand tonight if you want to. 2 miles of it, wrapping the landward side of the city in a stone horseshoe from the later site of the tower in the east to the later site of Blackfriars in the west. Around 20 feet high, 8 or 9 feet thick at the base. Built from Kentish ragstone, a hard grey-green limestone quarried near Maidstone and shipped down the Medway and up the Thames. Barge load after barge load, and we know exactly how it came because in 1962, workmen at Blackfriars found one of the barges, sunk in the Black River mud with its cargo still aboard, 26 tons of ragstone that never reached the wall. Some foreman 18 centuries ago logged that boat as a loss and ordered another. The wall swallowed tens of thousands of tons of stone and it defined a shape, a boundary, roughly 330 acres inside. Call it a square mile once the riverfront filled in. Look at what has just happened, because this is the second piece of the answer, and it is made of stone. From the year 200 onward, there is a hard, physical, permanent line around this city. Inside the wall and outside the wall become different worlds, and they will still be different legal worlds when men are landing on the moon. The ceremonial dragons that stand on London streets today, the one the Queen's carriage stopped at, stand almost exactly where the wall's gates and bars once controlled the roads. The border you cannot see on a modern map is the fossil of a wall you can still see, in fragments, behind a hotel near the Tower, in a quiet courtyard off Noble Street. Grey Roman courses at the bottom, medieval patching above like rings in a tree. Rome itself did not last. By the year 410 the empire was collapsing inward. The legions were gone, and the Emperor Honorius, answering a desperate appeal from Britain, sent back the imperial equivalent of a shrug, telling the British cities to look to their own defence. The ships stopped coming, and a city that exists to move goods and take a cut cannot survive the end of the goods. Londinium did not fall in battle. It simply emptied over a few generations, like a tide going out. The roofs fell in. The Forum sprouted elder trees. By the year 500, the greatest city in Britain was a walled ruin inhabited by wind. And this is not a legend. It is one of the strangest archaeological facts in Europe. Dark earth. The diggers call the layer that formed above the Roman rubble. A long silence, written in soil. But watch. Watch what happens next. Because nothing shows you the city's nature better. The Saxons who now held the land were farmers and seafarers, and they wanted nothing to do with the ghost town. They were not city people, and a 2-mile stone ruin full of collapsed vaults was, to them, uncanny, the work of giants, as one Saxon poet actually wrote of Roman ruins. But the river was still the river. The tide still ran. And so, in the 600s, trade crept back, and a new trading town grew up, not inside the walls, but just to the west, along the curve of what is now the Strand. On the shore between the two ancient sites, the beach settlement of Lundenwick, Wick meaning trading place. The monk Bede, writing around the year 731, called London a mart of many nations resorting to it by sea and land. A mart of many nations. Same city, same instinct, new address. When the Vikings came in the 800s and made an open beach town a suicidal place to keep your goods, the Saxons finally swallowed their unease and moved back inside the Roman walls, where the stone still stood tall and only the gates needed mending. The year was 886, and the king who restored the old city was Alfred the Great. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives it barely a line. that Alfred occupied London and made the Bure habitable again. The beach town was abandoned in its turn and remembered only in a name, Aldwych, the Old Wick, which is still painted on street signs today, a bus stop named after a city that lasted 200 years. So by the year 900, the walled city is alive again, and already it is developing the personality that will drive kings to fury. It has markets and moots, its own assemblies, its own customs. It pays for its walls, it mans its walls, and it negotiates with this king and that claimant as something dangerously close to an equal, because everyone who wants the crown of England needs two things London has: money and men. Hold that thought too, because it is the third piece of the answer, and it is the sharpest one. A king can beat London in a fight. No king can afford the fight. But first, at last, someone has to notice the Bramble Island. It is a raw grey morning somewhere in the 960s, and you're kneeling in cold mud on Thorney Island, hauling an eel trap when the bell starts. Not much of a bell. A single flat note from the little Minster church behind you, calling a handful of monks to prayer. You're a fisherman, as your father was, and the island is your landlord now, because the church holds this damp place these days, and the great reforming Bishop Dunstan, a fierce, difficult holy man who will one day be a saint, has settled a small community of Benedictine monks here, perhaps a dozen of them. The documents credit King Edgar and Dunstan with this refounding around the year 959 or 960, and I will be straight with you. Everything earlier is fog. Later monks claim their church was far older, planted back in the age when St. Paul's was first raised inside the walled city downstream in the year 604. They even told a story that St. Peter himself had appeared one night, ferried over by a fisherman just like you to consecrate the church with his own hands, paying his fare with a miraculous catch and a promise of salmon tithes forever. It is a lovely story. It is also exactly the kind of story monks told when they needed their island to matter, and no document from the time backs it up. What the record actually shows is humbler, a small minster on a small island, with wet feet. But its name, say its name, because the name holds the whole geography of this story in one word. The city downstream already has its great church, St. Paul's, standing inside the Roman walls for 3.5 centuries. This little church on Thorney lies 2 miles upstream west of the city, so it becomes known by the obvious name, the minster in the west, the Westminster, Westminster. You haul the trap, and there are 2 eels in it, sliding over each other like a knot trying to untie itself, cold silk over astonishing muscle, and one of them is for the monks, because that is the rent. You look downstream, east, past the river bend. On a clear day you can see the smoke of London hanging above its walls, the smoke of thousands of hearth fires, of smiths and bakers and brewers, the smoke of money. Boats pass you all day heading for its wharves, and nobody stops here. And why would they? Here there is mud, prayer and eels. 2 miles, 2 settlements now at last, a city of merchants and a church in a swamp. Nothing connects them but brown water, and nothing about them is equal, and if you had told that fisherman the swamp would one day give orders to an empire, he would have laughed his cold morning laugh and gone back to his traps. What the island needed was a king, and in the year 1042 it got one. A king so pale, so pious, so unlike other kings, that men came to call him the Confessor. It is the 28th of December, 1065, 3 days after Christmas, and your hands will not warm up no matter what you do with them. You're a mason, and you've been one for 30 years, and for the last decade and more you have given your working life to a single building, the new Abbey Church rising on Thorney Island. And this morning, at last, they are consecrating it. You're standing at the back of a crowd of earls and bishops and household men in furs, in air so cold your breath hangs in front of your face like wool. And you are looking up at the thing you built. Your palms are cracked at the base of every finger. The deep white splits that stone dust works into a mason's skin in winter, and when you flex them the cracks pull and sting, and you flex them anyway, because you cannot stop touching this moment. Nobody in England has ever seen a building like it. You know this for a fact, because men who have travelled tell you so, and because you have spent years cutting stone for shapes that no English mason's father ever cut. The king brought the design from Normandy, where he spent his long exile, a style the chroniclers will call Romanesque. Great round arches marching down a stone nave, arcade above arcade, a central tower, and the sheer size of it, well over 300 feet long, the largest church north of the Alps in its day. It has taken a meaningful share of the wealth of the whole kingdom. One chronicler says the king poured 1/10 of his substance into it, and it stands where the little monastery of the eel tithe stood, swallowing it, the way an oak swallows the shadow of the acorn. Here is the question you should be asking, the question this entire night turns on. Why here? Why would Edward the Confessor, King of England, build the greatest church in northern Europe on a damp island in a marsh, 2 miles from his capital city, when London already had St. Paul's and a dozen lesser minsters inside its walls, with dry ground and paved streets, and every craftsman on earth? And the answer is the fourth piece of our puzzle, and it is this. He did not want to be inside the walls. Kings of England, by long habit, did not really live in London. They visited it, taxed it, needed it, and were plainly, quietly uneasy in it. Because inside those Roman walls the crowd was too big, the money was too independent, and the citizens had opinions and weapons and a long memory of their own customs. A king inside London was a guest, and kings do not enjoy being guests. So Edward did something that looks small and turns out to be enormous. Alongside his great church he built himself a palace, on the island, outside the city, and he moved in. Court, council, treasury clerks, the whole slow machinery of ruling, settled 2 miles upstream of the merchants, on the Westminster's island, and from that decision, that one house move in the 1050s and 60s, everything else in this story unspools. Because from this point on, England's government and England's wealth live at separate addresses. The Crown at Westminster, the money in London, 2 miles of riverbank between them, and every ambitious man in English history will spend his life being rowed up and down that gap. You should notice the date again. The consecration is the 28th of December, 1065, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, and there is a hole in the middle of the ceremony, and the hole is the king. Edward is not here. Edward is in the palace 100 yards away, dying. He had planned this day for years, his life's work blessed at Christmas with all England watching, and when the day came he could not rise from his bed, and his wife Edith represented him in the church he built. You stand in the cold with your cracked hands and you listen to the singing, and every man in that crowd is thinking about the succession and pretending to think about God. He lasted 8 days. On the 4th or 5th of January 1066, Edward the Confessor died in his new palace, and they buried him the next morning before the high altar of the abbey that had been consecrated for 1 week. And on the very same day, in the very same church, with the grave barely closed, Earl Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. Burial and coronation inside a single January day, in a building smelling of new stone and incense and haste. You were there for that too, at the edge of it, and what you remember is the speed. Nobody wanted daylight between one king and the next. Everybody knew what was coming across the water, and so, before the terrible year 1066 even properly begins, the pattern is set, and it will never break. Westminster Abbey has held a royal burial and a royal coronation in its first 2 weeks of consecrated life. From Harold onward, with only 2 exceptions in 1,000 years, every crowned English and British monarch will be crowned in that church, on that island, in that city, Westminster. Not in London, never in London. The City of London will never once hold a coronation, and here is the thing that should stop you mid-thought. The city never wanted one. Let Westminster have the anointing oil and the incense. London kept the customs house. We can leave the mason there in the cold flexing his split hands. What became of him, no one can say, and I will not pretend otherwise. The rolls that would have held his name are dust, but the walls he dressed stood for 2 centuries until a later king rebuilt the church in the pointed Gothic style you see today. And deep in the fabric, under the floor, pieces of the Confessor's Abbey are still down there, and the Bayeux tapestry, stitched within living memory of that winter, shows the church itself, with a workman still fixing the weathercock, as if the embroiderers wanted you to know how new it was, how the mortar had barely dried on the whole idea of Westminster. 9 months after Harold's hasty coronation, the world ended again. You know this part, or you think you do. William, Duke of Normandy, landed in the south with an army and a papal banner and a claim, and on the 14th of October, 1066, at Hastings, Harold died with an English shield wall around him, and among the men who marched south to stand in that wall were the trained men of London, because London fought for its king when it chose him. The battle lasted a day. The conquest of England took years, but the conquest of London took a piece of parchment, and that piece of parchment still exists, and it is now time to read it. It is Christmas Day 1066, and you are standing in the crowd outside Westminster Abbey, and you can smell smoke, and the smoke is wrong. You're a London burgess, a man of standing in the city, a dealer in wool with a house near the bridge, and you have come upstream with the other leading men because there was no choice left. After Hastings, William did not attack London. He tried the bridge once, was blooded at its southern end, and then did something colder and smarter. He walked around the city in a great slow circle, west and north, burning the countryside as he went, every field, every barn, every manor that fed the London markets, until the city sat in a ring of ash, and then he waited. No food coming in, no allies left. The city's leaders, and the last English claimant sheltering among them, rode out to submit to him at Berkhamsted. And now, on Christmas morning, the Norman is being crowned in the Confessor's Abbey, on the island, exactly where English kings are made, because William's entire claim is that he is not a conqueror but a lawful heir, and lawful heirs are crowned at Westminster. Inside the church they ask the crowd in English and in French whether they will have William for their king, and the crowd shouts assent as crowds at coronations do. And the Norman knights stationed outside, hearing a roar in a language they do not know, in a hostile country, on a dark December morning, decide it is a rising, and they do what frightened armed men do. They set fire to the nearby houses. You're out there in it, in the sudden heat and the screaming, watching thatch go up like paper while inside the abbey the ceremony stumbles on, the new king shaking by one chronicler's account as the smoke drifts up the nave. A coronation lit by arson. That is how Norman rule begins at Westminster, and it is documented by men writing within living memory, and I want you to keep the picture because of what happens next. What happens next is that this same William, this man of fire and ash rings, sits down with his clerks and writes a letter to London. It survives. That is not a figure of speech. The document itself, the actual object, a strip of parchment about 6 inches wide, written in English, not Latin, not French, in English, so that the men it addressed could hear it in their own tongue, is kept to this day by the City of London at the Guildhall, and it is the oldest document in the city's archive, and men have called it the city's birth certificate, though it is really something stranger. It is a peace treaty between a king and a town. It is short enough to hold in one breath. William the King greets William the Bishop and Geoffrey the Portreeve, the city's chief officer, and all the burghers within London, French and English, in friendly fashion. And I declare that I grant you to be worthy of all the laws you were worthy of in King Edward's day, and I will that every child be his father's heir after his father's day, and I will not endure that any man offer any wrong to you. God keep you. Read it again slowly, because every clause is a surrender dressed as a gift. All the laws of King Edward's day, meaning your old customs, stand. I change nothing inside your walls. Every child his father's heir, meaning I will not confiscate your property. Your wealth stays yours, generation to generation. I will not endure that any man offer you any wrong, meaning my own barons included. This from the man who was at that moment planning to comb every shire in England into Domesday Book, and hand half the country to his followers. London is famously, conspicuously absent from Domesday Book. The great survey that counted every pig in every hamlet in England never counted London. The city that fought for Harold, the city he starved into submission, got its entire legal world confirmed in 5 sentences, sealed in the conquered people's own language. Why? Because William could count. He needed London's silver for his wars, London's wharves for his supply lines, London's markets for his kingdom to function, and he knew what it had cost him to strangle the city into surrender once, and he never wanted to do it again. Cheaper to charter it. And because he was no fool, he also did the other thing, and you can still see the other thing from Tower Bridge. In the corner of the Roman wall, at the city's eastern edge, he began a fortress, the great pale keep men would call the White Tower, 90 feet of Caen stone shipped from Normandy, begun around 1078. And you must understand what the Tower of London actually is, because everyone gets it backwards. It does not face outward, guarding London from invaders. It squats on the city's own wall, glowering inward, guarding the king from London. One building says everything about the relationship. He gave them the charter with one hand and built the tower with the other. So there it is. The 4th piece and the 5th side by side on the riverbank. At Westminster, the crown, the abbey, the anointing, the government. In London, the charter, the wall, the money, the customs of King Edward's day, guaranteed forever by the most complete conqueror England ever suffered. He conquered the kingdom and he bargained with the city. Every king after him will inherit that bargain, and some of them will hate it, and one of them, on a January afternoon 6 centuries later, will break it, and we will be standing on Cheapside watching when he does. But between William and that January afternoon lies the century when the bargain grew teeth, because a promise from a king is weather. What London wanted was climate, and in the year 1215, from the worst king England ever produced, London got it in writing twice in one summer. It is the 9th of May, 1215, a wet spring evening, and you are standing under the dripping eaves of your master's shop on Cheapside, holding a torch you're not entirely sure you're allowed to be holding, listening to a man read Latin to a street full of soaked and delighted merchants. You are 15, an apprentice mercer, which means silk and fine cloth, which mostly means, at your age, carrying, folding, sweeping, and standing outside in the rain holding things. The rain has soaked through the shoulders of your wool tunic, and the wet wool smells like a sheep having a bad month, and the torch spits every time a drop finds the pitch. A small angry hiss beside your ear. But nobody's going indoors, because the man on the steps of the conduit is reading a royal charter, fresh from the king's clerks, its great seal of green wax swinging below it on silk cords, and your master, a careful man who taught you never to show excitement during a negotiation, is gripping his hood in both hands like a boy at a bear baiting. The charter says, once the Latin is chewed down into English for the crowd, something like this. The barons of the City of London may choose for themselves a mayor every year from among themselves, their own man, chosen by them, not appointed by the king, answerable to the city first, sworn to the king after. A city that elects its own head of government, annually, in the year 1215. To understand why grown merchants are standing in the rain, grinning about an administrative procedure, you need the background, so here it is, quickly, while the boy's torch burns. London had been electing a mayor quietly, on and off, for about a generation, since around 1189, when a rich and iron-willed citizen named Henry Fitzelwyn first took the title, and then, in the way of founders everywhere, kept it until he died. But that arrangement lived in the twilight, tolerated by kings when they were weak, deniable when they were strong. What has changed is the king, John. John has lost Normandy, lost his barons' trust, taxed the country white to fund losing wars, and by this spring of 1215 he is a man selling furniture out of a burning house. The northern barons are in open revolt, and John, desperate to keep the one city whose money and walls can decide the whole war, tries to buy London's neutrality with this charter. The mayor, elected every year, forever. It is a bribe. Everyone in this wet street knows it is a bribe. That is why they are smiling. There is no purer pleasure in London's entire history than being bribed with something it already considered its own. And now watch what the city does with the bribe, because this is London's oldest trick, and you should learn to spot it. It will happen again and again tonight. The city takes the king's concession with grave thanks, and 8 days later, on the 17th of May, 1215, while the good folk are at Mass, London opens its gates to the rebel barons. Not a siege, not a betrayal by some traitor at a postern gate, a civic decision. The barons ride in unopposed. The city becomes the rebellion's fortress and bank, and from that moment John has lost, because he cannot pay his mercenaries while London's silver pays his enemies, and he cannot take the city back, because nobody takes London, you only starve it, and he has neither the time nor the army. Within a month, on the 15th of June, 1215, in a meadow upstream called Runnymede, halfway between Windsor and the city whose defection broke him, John seals Magna Carta. You've heard of Magna Carta. Trial by one's peers, no taxation without counsel, the clauses that echo down into every constitution on earth. But tonight I want you to look at one clause only, the one nobody puts on posters, Clause 13. The City of London shall have all its ancient liberties and free customs, both by land and by water. That is the whole clause. It does not list the liberties, it does not define them. And that vagueness is not sloppiness, it is craftsmanship, paid for almost certainly by the city itself, because an undefined liberty is an unlimited one. For 800 years, whenever anyone in power asked the City of London to justify some ancient oddity of its constitution, the city has been able to reach back to that sentence and say, ancient liberties, all of them, it says so in Magna Carta, and if you wish to dispute which liberties, you are welcome to sue the oldest legal team in Europe. And one more detail, my favourite detail in the whole 13th century. Magna Carta ends with an enforcement clause, 25 barons chosen to hold the king to his word, with the legal right to make war on him if he breaks it. 24 of them are exactly what you would expect. The great feudal lords of England, men with castles and private armies and grudges. The 25th is the Mayor of London, a merchant, a man whose weapon of war is a ledger, sitting as an equal among the sword-bearing aristocracy of England, on the committee legally entitled to declare war on the king. His name was William Hardle, and he is one of the real documented people in this story, Mayor of London in that charter year, and with him the office itself steps out of the twilight and into the marrow of the English constitution, and it has never stepped back. There was, of course, a catch in the May Charter, and the catch became a carnival. The new mayor, each year, had to be presented to the king or his justices to swear loyalty. And where were the king's justices? 2 miles upstream at Westminster, where the Confessor's Palace had grown into the permanent home of the Exchequer and the law courts. So every year, from 1215 onward, the newly elected Mayor of London had to physically travel from the city to Westminster, out of his own jurisdiction, across the invisible line, into the King's City, to take his oath and be admitted. And every year, the city, which has never once in its history underproduced a piece of theatre, made the journey bigger. Liveried barges on the river by the 15th century gilded and rode in procession, which is why to this day the word for a decorated platform in a parade is a float. Trumpets, banners, the city companies in their colours, giants of wicker and paint. It is still happening. It has happened for more than 800 years, through plague years and war years, and it is called the Lord Mayor's Show, and it rolls through London every November, and nearly everyone watching it thinks it is a parade. It is not a parade. It is the annual reenactment of the treaty between two cities. The elected chief of the merchant city travels to the royal city to swear loyalty to the crown, and then, this is the part to savour, he goes home to the square mile where he, not the king, presides. The oath is the tribute. The going home is the point. Somewhere in the crowd at the first of those oath-takings, let us leave your 15-year-old self, rain-wet, torch-guttering, watching your city celebrate the paperwork of its own independence. What became of that apprentice? No one can say, and I won't invent it. But the office he watched being born has now been held, in unbroken annual succession, by very nearly 700 men and women, and the current holder still signs letters as the Lord Mayor of London, still lives for 1 year above the shop and still ranks within the square mile by ancient precedents, ahead of everybody in the kingdom except the sovereign. Not ahead of everybody except the government, ahead of everybody except the king himself. Princes, prime ministers, archbishops within that 1 square mile, all of them walk behind the merchant. So now the machine is built and you can see all its parts. Westminster has the Crown, the abbey, the courts, the parliaments that begin in this same 13th century to meet in the royal palace there. London has the wall, the wealth, the charters, the annual mayor, and Clause 13. 2 cities, formally bound, formally separate, each holding something the other cannot live without. Westminster holds legitimacy, London holds the money, and the road between them, that 2-mile stretch along the river, fills up through the 14th and 15th centuries with the palaces of bishops and earls, men who needed to be near both kinds of power at once, a street of hedge-betting in stone, and its name is the Strand, and at the point where it meets the city's western boundary there stands, from at least the year 1293, a bar, a chain first, then a gate, the bar of the Temple, named for the Templar church beside it. Temple Bar. Write that name on the inside of your eyelids, because the whole story keeps coming back to it, and so will we. By the time the Tudors arrive, the 2 cities have grown toward each other along that road until their buildings touch, and a foreign visitor, walking from Westminster to London Bridge, would swear he had passed through one continuous town. The seam had vanished from the ground. It survived everywhere else, in law, in ceremony, in the head, and no family ever managed the seam more skillfully than the Tudors, and no Tudor more skillfully than the last of them, the woman who gave the city the pearl sword. It is the 24th of November, 1588, and you're being crushed, pleasantly, against a shop front on the Strand by roughly 40 of your fellow subjects, waiting for the Queen. You're a glover's journeyman, 22 years old, and you have been holding your patch of cobble since before dawn, and your feet passed through pain into a kind of philosophical numbness 2 hours ago. The morning smells of horse dung and rosemary, because the crowd has been throwing sprigs of it, and of the sea-coal smoke that hangs over everything in this city every winter. The word all autumn has been of the Armada, the great Spanish invasion fleet, 130 ships, broken this summer by gunfire and weather, and today Elizabeth I rides in procession to St. Paul's Cathedral in the city to give thanks to God for the victory, and she is coming this way, and the cannon at the tower have been sounding since morning, a slow bronze heartbeat you feel through the soles of your dead feet. And then she is there, in a chariot throne drawn by white horses, and the roar comes up the Strand toward you like weather, and just when the procession reaches full magnificent speed, it stops at the gate. At Temple Bar, the city's western bar, where the Lord Mayor of London and the aldermen in scarlet wait on horseback, and the ceremony that queens and kings will still be performing more than 4 centuries later, unfolds, documented this time in print by the celebratory accounts of that very year. The Lord Mayor delivers up the city's sword to the Queen. The Queen returns it to him, and he then carries it, raised, before her as she enters the city, the visible sign that within these bounds the sword of state is wielded by the city's own chief officer on the Crown's behalf in the city's hands. She did not ask permission. Let me keep my promise and be precise. The gates of London were never going to be shut against Gloriana in her triumph year, and both sides knew it. And both sides also knew that the stopping itself, the handing over, the handing back, was the whole Constitution of England performed in dumb show in about 4 minutes, respect offered upward, liberties confirmed downward. Everyone bows, nobody blinks, and the border is fed for another generation. As for the pearl sword itself, the one from the opening of our story, city tradition holds that Elizabeth gave it in 1571 at the opening of the Royal Exchange, the city's great trading floor, and that the pearls were her gift to the merchant's capital. I have to be honest with you once more. That origin rests on tradition rather than surviving receipt, and I will not sell you a tradition as a document. What is certain is that the sword exists, that it is old, that its scabbard carries its thousands of pearls, and that it comes out to this day for exactly one purpose: to be offered to the sovereign at the city's boundary. A weapon that has never cut anything but ceremony. Elizabeth understood the two-city game so well because she needed the city so badly, its loans, its ships, its gun founders, its credit in Antwerp and Hamburg. Her successors understood it less, and her second successor, a stiff, small, stammering man with an absolute theory of kingship and no ear whatsoever for the music of that 4-minute ceremony, is about to walk this whole 700-year-old bargain off a cliff in a single week of January. His name is Charles Stuart, the first King Charles, and we have arrived at last at the afternoon this entire story has been travelling toward. It is the afternoon of the 5th of January 1642, and you are supposed to be minding the stall, and instead you are standing on an upturned crate in a doorway off Cheapside, because the King of England is in the city, and the city is about to do something no one alive has ever seen. You are 17, apprenticed to a stationer, a seller of books and pamphlets near the Guildhall, and for a stationer's boy this past week has been the busiest of your life, because London is at war with its king in print before it is at war with him, in fact, and every day the presses spit out news, sheets still tacky with ink, and your fingertips are permanently grey-black with it, and the smell of it, linseed and lamp-black, has soaked into your sleeves so deeply that you smell it in your dreams. To hold the freshest sheet is to hold the future a day early. Everyone wants it. Everyone is afraid of it. Here is what the sheets have been screaming, and here is where I step back from your crate for 1 minute and give you the facts as the documents give them, because this week is among the best recorded weeks of the 17th century. Sworn testimony, parliamentary journals, letters, memoirs, and it needs no embroidery from me. For a year, King and Parliament have been circling each other over money, religion, and an army raised to crush rebellion in Ireland that each side fears the other will use at home. On the 3rd of January, the King's Attorney General stood up in Westminster and accused 5 members of the House of Commons of high treason: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Holles, Arthur Hazelrig, William Strode, the 5 loudest thorns in the royal side. Parliament declined to surrender them. And on the following afternoon, the 4th of January 1642, King Charles did the thing that no English monarch had ever done, and no English monarch has ever done since. He went to the House of Commons in person to make the arrest himself, and he did not go alone. He crossed from Whitehall with a crowd of armed officers and gentlemen, hundreds of them by the accounts, swords and pistols, who filled the lobby and held the door open while the King walked up the floor of the House. He asked the Speaker, William Lenthal, where the 5 members were, and Lenthal knelt and gave the answer that constitutional history has kept polished ever since. May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see, nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here. The Speaker of the Commons on his knees telling the King to his face, no. Charles looked around the benches for his prey and said, aloud, I see the birds are flown. Then he walked out through a silence that one witness said was broken only as the door closed, by a low growl from the members, a single word repeated. Privilege, privilege. The birds had flown, and now mark carefully where they flew, because this is the hinge of the whole night. They did not flee to an army. There was no army to flee to, not yet. They did not ride for the coast or the hills. They went down the Thames stairs into a boat and 2 miles east, and they disappeared into the city of London, into the 1 square mile in England where the King's writ had always run last and thinnest. The 5 most wanted men in the kingdom were hidden by the city, in the maze of courts and lanes off Coleman Street, a short walk from where your crate is standing, and every soul on Cheapside knows it, and no soul on Cheapside is saying where. Which brings us to today, the 5th of January, and the astonishing thing that is happening in front of you. The King has followed them into the city, almost unattended this time in his coach, to demand his enemies back, not from Parliament this time, but from London itself. He has gone to Guildhall, the city's own seat of government, 100 yards from your master's shop, and he is in there right now, standing before the Common Council of London, the elected men of the wards, asking them, as their sovereign, to surrender the 5 members. And through the doors out into the packed street comes the sound of the answer. It is not a riot. It is worse for him. It is a chant, disciplined, growing, from hundreds of citizen throats inside and outside the hall. The same 2 words the Commons growled yesterday. Privilege of Parliament, privilege of Parliament. Some cry, God save the King, and the 2 chants braid together into something no king could mistake. We honour you, and you may not have them. The Common Council will not give the men up. The city has looked its anointed sovereign in the eye, in its own hall, and refused. Then the doors open, and he comes out, and you see him, small, upright, immaculate, his face shut like a strong-box, walking through a lane of citizens who bare their heads because he is the King, and chant against him with their heads bared because they are London. He enters the coach, and as it begins to move, jolting on the cobbles toward you, the crowd pressing it so close that the horses can barely walk, a paper is thrown, one of 100 papers thrown that day, but this one, witnesses recorded, sailed in at the coach window, and on it was printed a phrase every Bible-reading soul in that street could finish from memory. To your tents, O Israel. The words the tribes of Israel shouted when they abandoned their king. The politest declaration of war ever thrown through a window. The coach passes you close enough to touch. You do not touch it. You stand on your crate with your ink-black fingers pressed against the cold brick, and you watch the glass, and behind the glass for one instant, the king's face, looking out at the shops and the signs and the 1,000 bared heads of the richest street in his kingdom. And you are 17, and even you can read that face. It is the face of a man doing arithmetic and getting the same answer over and over. He has no troops enough to take this city. The city knows it. He knows the city knows it. What happens in the next 5 days is a city remembering joint by joint that it is a fortress. The shops shut. The chains, kept oiled for centuries in the ward houses for exactly this hour, go rattling across the street mouths. The portcullises drop at the gates. The trained bands, London's citizen militia, thousands strong, muster under arms, and Parliament appoints a tough professional soldier, Philip Skippon, to command them, the Sergeant Major General of the city's forces, taking his orders not from Whitehall but from Westminster and Guildhall together. Cannon appear at the gates, chains across the river. Rumour arrives nightly that the king's cavaliers are coming, and the whole city stands to arms in the dark, and your master stands at his shop door with a halberd he last carried at a muster 20 years ago, and does not send you to bed. And on the 10th of January 1642, the king blinks. Charles Stuart takes his queen, his children, and his household, and leaves Whitehall, leaves Westminster, leaves both cities for Hampton Court, and then the north. The next morning, the 11th of January, the 5 members come out of hiding, and the city gives them a victory procession back to Westminster, by water, of course. The whole river dressed, barge after barge, the trained bands lining the banks, guns saluting. The 2-mile journey between the two cities transformed into a triumph. The exact route of the Lord Mayor's oath-swearing, run in reverse by the men the king could not catch, delivered back to Parliament by the city that would not yield them. I want to give you the 10-second version now so it sits clean in your memory, because this is the peak of the whole 1,000-year story. In January 1642, the King of England tried to arrest 5 men. Parliament said no, so the men hid in the city of London. The king came to the city in person and asked for them. The city said no, and the king turned and left his own capital, and the next time Charles Stuart entered London as its acknowledged king was never. When he finally returned 7 years later, it was as a prisoner to stand trial at Westminster Hall in the royal city, and on the 30th of January 1649, on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, in Westminster, not in London, the axe came down. The merchant city never took the king. It never had to. It only ever had to shut its gates and wait, and the door it shut in January 1642 was, in the judgment of historian after historian, the moment his cause became unwinnable, because the side that holds London holds the money, the arsenal, the port, and the printing presses, and the war that followed only spelled out in blood, over 7 years, what Cheapside had already decided in an afternoon. Your 17-year-old stationer's boy watched the coach go, and then, because he was an apprentice and it was January, he went back inside and swept the shop, and history closed over him, as it closes over almost everyone. And whoever he really was, that is all the ending he gets from me. But the 2 words he heard chanted at Guildhall are still, at this hour, part of the ceremonial opening of every parliament. To this day, when the monarch's messenger, Black Rod, approaches the House of Commons to summon it before the throne, the door of the Commons is slammed shut in his face, deliberately, every time, and he must knock 3 times and be inspected before he's admitted. And that little pantomime of the slammed door is the official, living memory of the 4th of January 1642, the day a king came to take 5 members and the door of England closed against him. The Crown has been knocking politely ever since, and now, gently, the story starts its long descent, and so do you. The war's end. The king's son comes back in 1660 to bells and wine fountains, and the 2 cities resume their ancient dance as if the interruption had been a bad dream, because the dance was always stronger than the dancers. But the square mile has 2 more trials ahead, utterly different in kind, and it needs to survive both of them for you to find it still standing there tonight, dragon-guarded inside the modern glass. The first trial is fire. The second, slower and stranger, is paperwork. It is a little after 2 in the morning on Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1666, and what wakes you is not the shouting. It is the light. You're a waterman's daughter, 16, asleep in the loft of a riverside house near Billingsgate Fish Market, and the small window above your pallet, which should hold September darkness, is holding instead a soft orange flutter, like a candle behind oiled paper, except that it fills the whole window, and the timbers of the house are ticking gently, the way they do at noon in summer when the sun warms them. At 2 in the morning, you lie still for 3 heartbeats, watching the light breathe on the rafters. Then you hear your father on the ladder, and his voice has the flat calm that frightens you more than any shouting ever has. Get up, girl. The bridge end is burning. It began. The inquiries later established. A few 100 yards from your loft, in Pudding Lane, in the bakery of Thomas Farriner, the King's baker, sometime after midnight, an oven not fully raked out, a stack of kindling, a dry house in a dry lane at the end of a drought summer. These are the documented facts. The Lord Mayor of that year, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was pulled from his bed to come and looked, and delivered the most regretted sentence in the history of a local government: a woman might piss it out, and went back to bed. By the time the sun rose, a firestorm was running west on a strong east wind, and the diarist Samuel Pepys, watching from the tower's battlements and then from a boat on the river, wrote down everything: the pigeons that would not leave their eaves until their wings caught, the river thick with lighters full of rescued goods, the fire drops falling on the boats, the arch of flame a mile long climbing the hill of the city as night came down. One entire arch of fire, he wrote. It made me weep to see it. It burned for 4 days, and because this channel keeps its promises about numbers, here are the numbers from the surveys made afterward. 436 acres of the city gone, 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, old St. Paul's Cathedral, the medieval giant on the hill, whose lead roof melted and ran down the streets in a glowing stream, so that people said you could see the cathedral flowing away downhill. The Guildhall itself, seat of the city's government, gutted, though its ancient stone walls stood in the wreck, and one witness described it glowing after dark like a palace of gold, a bright shining coal. The recorded death toll was absurdly small, a handful of verified names, and historians have argued ever since that the true count among the poor and the nameless must have been higher, and I give you both the record and the doubt, which is the honest thing. Your girl in the loft spent those 4 days on the water with her father, and the river was the strangest marketplace it had ever been, because a waterman's boat was suddenly worth its weight in rescued silver, and prices for a cartload or a boatload multiplied by 10, by 20, profiteering measured and complained of in a dozen surviving letters. 16 years old, hauling other people's feather beds and virginals and ledgers over the gunwale, while the city where she was born folded into light behind her. On the 4th day the wind dropped. The gunpowder crews blew the last fire breaks, and it was over, and roughly 4/5 of the walled city of London did not exist any more. Perhaps 70 or 80,000 people out of their homes, camped in the fields north of the wall, watching the smoke. Now, here is why this chapter is in this story. Because in September 1666, the city of London, the physical thing, the timber and plaster fact of it, was gone, and every planner in England saw the opportunity of 10 centuries. Within days, Christopher Wren was at the King's elbow with a new plan for London, and he was not alone. John Evelyn had one too. Great straight avenues, piazzas, a rational grid, a Paris, a Rome, a city worthy of a modern crown to be laid out clean over the ash. And King Charles II, son of the man whose coach we watched turn away on Cheapside, was warmly interested. Here at last was the chance to rebuild the stubborn old Warren as a royal city, planned from above. It never happened, and the reason it never happened is the whole point of the whole night. The ground was owned, every scorched foot of it. Freeholds, leaseholds, tenancies, rights of light, party walls, ancient rents, the whole invisible cobweb of possession that the fire could not touch, because the fire could only burn what was physical, and the city of London was never really a physical thing. It was, and is, a structure of rights. To lay out Wren's avenues, the Crown would have had to buy out or override tens of thousands of separate property claims, and there was no money, and there was no time, because trade was bleeding away to other ports every idle week, and deeper than either, there was no power, because overriding the property of the citizens of London wholesale was precisely the kind of thing that the last king had lost his head for approaching. So the merchants rebuilt their city themselves, on their own plots, along their own crooked medieval lanes, the same frontages, the same alleys, the same property lines, only now in brick instead of timber, by order of the Rebuilding Act of 1667, wider here and there, better paved, but recognisably, street for street, the London of before. That is why tonight, in the age of skyscrapers, the street plan of the financial district of London is still, in its bones, medieval. Walk from Cheapside down Bread Street or Milk Street, and you are walking the plan of the 11th century, preserved not by sentiment but by stubbornness. Because in 1666 the city would rather keep its tangled freeholds than accept a beautiful city drawn by the Crown. The fire which destroyed everything changed nothing. Chew on that sentence, because it is the 6th piece of the answer. The corporation did not miss a beat. The Court of Aldermen was meeting within days at Gresham College, which the flames had spared. The Lord Mayor's election came in October, as it came every October, and the Lord Mayor's show went ahead, diminished but unbroken. The constitution of the square mile passed through a 4-day firestorm without a scratch, and came out the other side having proved something profound about itself. You cannot burn it. It is not made of the kind of thing that burns. They did get one monument to ambition out of the ashes, because Wren, denied his city plan, was given the churches instead, 51 of them, and the cathedral. The new St. Paul's rose slowly over 35 years, and was declared complete in 1711. The great dome, 365 feet to the cross at the top, floating above the rebuilt Warren, and beside Pudding Lane they raised a single colossal column, 202 feet of Portland stone, which is exactly the distance from its base to the site of Farriner's Bakery, and they called it, with the city's characteristic gift for the plain name, the Monument. You can climb it tonight, 311 steps, and stand above the streets and see what this whole story looks like from the air, the dome, the towers, the river, and, if you know where to look, the line, the invisible line in the west, where the city ends and everything else pretends. And so the 18th century rolls in, and the 19th after it, and the nature of the threat changes completely. And this is where the story goes quiet and strange, like the last hour of a long train journey, because the enemies stop carrying swords. Nobody will ever again besiege the square mile with an army. Instead, they will come with something far more dangerous. Reports, commissions, recommendations. The 19th century does not want to conquer the City of London. It wants to tidy it up. And watching the city survive being tidied is one of the great slow comedies of English history. It is a Tuesday evening in November 1888, thick with fog, and you are lighting lamps. You are a lamplighter, 51 years old, and your round is the Victoria Embankment and the streets north of it, up to the Strand, and your shoulder aches in the way it always aches by the 400 yards. The long pole braced against it, the little spirit flame at its tip nodding above you like a tame star. The fog tonight is a proper London particular. Coal yellow, tasting of sulphur at the back of the tongue, and each lamp you light does not so much shine as bruise the fog faintly gold for a few feet around itself. 30 years you have walked variations of this round, and you have watched from lamp height the biggest city the human race has ever built assemble itself round two small cities that refuse to admit they are related, because this is what happened while nobody was holding a ceremony. London grew, not the city. The city has been full since the Middle Ages. 1 square mile has no room to grow. London, the thing around it, the name spilled over the walls centuries ago and just kept going, swallowing villages, Islington, Hackney, Chelsea, Camberwell, 1 million people by 1800. The first city on earth to reach that number since ancient Rome. Over 5 million in the metropolis by the time your pole is nodding over the embankment. And all of it, this ocean of brick and gaslight and railway smoke, this greatest port and richest capital in the world, had, for most of your century, no government of its own at all. Think about that. The greatest city in human history, and no city government. Why? You know why by now. Because at its heart sat the ancient corporation, governing its 1 square mile magnificently and refusing, with total politeness and total finality, to take responsibility for anything beyond the dragons. And around it lay a chaos of parish vestries and paving boards, and every single scheme to create a real government for the real London ran into the same immovable object. The city would not be merged. The city would not be dissolved. The city had a wall of charters where the Roman stones used to be, and clause 13 underneath them, all like a foundation course. The reformers truly tried. This is the century of reform, after all, the century that abolished rotten boroughs and cleaned up every other ancient corporation in the country. By Act of Parliament in 1835, every municipal corporation in England reformed except one. The Act simply left the City of London out. Royal Commissions sat on the problem in 1837 and again in the 1850s, and solemnly concluded that the corporation was an indefensible medieval anomaly and recommended change, and published their volumes, and the volumes went onto shelves, and the city sent the commissioners a very good dinner. When the capital finally, desperately needed a body to build sewers, Parliament created the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1855 by statute, and gave it the whole metropolis to drain, and 3 summers later, in 1858, the Thames stank so badly that Parliament soaked its own curtains in chloride of lime, and fled its chamber, the great stink, and at last voted the board the money for its great sewers, and the city was of course inside those sewer maps and outside the board's authority in every way that mattered, keeping its own commission of sewers, thank you, as it had since after the Great Fire. And when at last, in 1889, the year after your foggy Tuesday, the London County Council was born, the first true government for the whole vast metropolis, an elected council for 4.5 million Londoners. Its inaugural maps showed the new county of London spreading magnificently from Hampstead to Norwood, with a hole in the middle. 1 square mile of hole. The City of London once again was not included. It sat inside the new county like a stone in a plum, self-governing, separately policed, flying its own flag. One more commission came for it, in 1893 and 1894, with amalgamation in its very title, the Royal Commission on the Amalgamation of the City and County of London, and it too recommended union, and the city fought it with pamphlets and dinners and lawyers and the patient. Bottomless obstruction of an institution that has been outwaiting kings since before the kingdom had its present shape, and the government of the day found other priorities, and in 1899 the metropolis got an act creating new borough councils instead, and Westminster, the other half of our story, was made one of them, and to mark the old distinction in 1900 by royal charter under Queen Victoria, its ancient rank was confirmed, and it stood again officially as what it had really been since the Confessor drained his island, a city, the city of Westminster. So the 19th century, the century of steam and steel and reform, the century that redrew the government of every town in Britain, ends with the score exactly where the 13th century left it. 2 cities, 1 name, no merger. You hook the last lamp of the round, and the mantle catches with its small soft gasp, and you stand for a moment in your bruise of gold light at the edge of the Strand, and just there, a few yards east, rising out of the fog on its stone pedestal, is a shape you watched them unveil 8 years ago in 1880. A dragon cast in bronze, wings up, tongue out, holding a shield, planted in the middle of the roadway on the exact spot where Temple Bar stood for 600 years, because the old gate itself is gone, and thereby hangs the century's one honest confession. Wren's great stone arch of 1672, the gate where Elizabeth touched the sword, where the heads of traitors were spiked on iron rods within living memory of your grandfather, where every monarch stopped, had by the 1870s become a strangler of traffic in the busiest street in the world, and in 1878 the city took it down, numbering every stone 2,700 stones, and stacked them in a yard, and a brewer's wife eventually bought the whole gate and re-erected it as a garden ornament at her country estate in Hertfordshire, where it stood among the trees for over a century, a city gate with no city guarding a lawn. The city never forgot it. Remember that. It matters later. And on the empty spot they raised the dragon and put the ceremony onto the dragon, so that when the sovereign comes, the carriage now stops at a statue, because the border no longer needs the gate. And this is the quiet, enormous lesson of the whole 19th century, the same lesson the Great Fire taught. Destroy the wall, the border remains. Remove the gate, the border remains. The border was never in the stones. The stones were only ever the border's way of being visible. The 20th century tried fire one more time from the air. On the night of the 29th of December, 1940, German incendiaries fell on the square mile in such numbers that the night entered the records as the second Great Fire of London, and once again the district around St. Paul's burned to the walls, and the most famous photograph of the whole war was taken that night from a rooftop, the dome riding above the smoke, lit by the burning city, untouched. And when the rubble of the Blitz was finally cleared, in the grey years afterward, the demolition men uncovered something that made the archaeologists run. The wall. Long stretches of the Roman and medieval wall at Cripplegate, along Noble Street, embedded for centuries inside the party walls of shops and warehouses that had now been blasted away. The original boundary of the original city, standing in the ruins like a signature revealed under paint. The bombs that destroyed a third of the square mile gave it back the sight of its own first edge. The city preserved the fragments, built its new brutalist towers and gardens around them at the Barbican, and if you go there on a quiet Sunday, you can stand with your hand flat on courses of ragstone that were barged up the river past our Britain with his bleeding knuckles, 1800 years and change before you were born. The stone is always cold, even in August. Touch it once in your life. And so we arrive at now, and it is time to walk the border one last time and count the strangeness, piece by piece, because the strangeness is all still there, hiding in the daylight. It is a few minutes before 6 on a summer morning in the present day, and you are crossing the invisible line with a coffee in your hand, and the only other creatures on the street are the ones who are always here first. The gulls, working the bins along Fleet Street. The city at this hour smells of cold stone, warm bread from a basement bakery, and the faint river mud tang that has underlain every other smell in this story for 2,000 years. The one constant nose note of London, older than the name. You work an early shift on a trading floor, you're 26, your shoes are still stiff, and your walk to work takes you, though almost none of your colleagues could tell you this, out of one city and into another. There is no sign saying so. There is a dragon, silver-painted, red-tongued, the size of a large dog, on a plinth at the roadside, holding a shield with a red cross, and in the first quarter a little red sword, the emblem of St. Paul. There are dragons like it at every road that crosses the boundary, and black bollards between them. And the boundary they mark is not the Roman wall's line anymore, but the slightly wider line the city's bars reached in the Middle Ages, and the dragons stand where the chains once hung. You pass the dragon every working day. You have never once wondered what it is guarding. It is guarding the answer to this story, because here is what is actually true, tonight, this year, about the ground you are walking. The city of London is still a separate city, not poetically, administratively. It is not one of London's 32 boroughs. It stands apart from all of them, governed by the City of London Corporation, which describes itself with a straight face and correctly as the oldest continuous municipal democracy in the world, its Court of Aldermen and Court of Common Council descending in unbroken line from the folk-moots of the Saxon Boer. Its head is still the Lord Mayor of London, elected annually, as per the Charter of 1215, still presented to the Crown's judges each November, still processing to Westminster behind the wicker giants, still ranking ahead of everyone but the sovereign inside the square mile. Nearly 700 of them now, in the unbroken chain that started with Fitzailwyn. The city still has its own police force. This is not a ceremonial flourish. It is 2 real constabularies with 2 real jurisdictions rubbing shoulders in one metropolis. In 1829, when Sir Robert Peel created the Metropolitan Police for the whole capital, the city simply declined to be included, and rather than fight the oldest lawyers in Europe, Parliament let it be, and in 1839 the city's own force was placed on statutory footing, and to this day, if your phone is snatched on one side of a certain street, one force investigates, and if it is snatched on the other side, another does, and you can tell the two apart because the city's officers wear red and white checkered bands, where the Met wears black and white. Red and white being the city's colours, as they were on the shields at the bar. The city still keeps an agent inside Parliament. He is called the Remembrancer, an office created in 1571 and his duty then and now is to sit in Westminster and watch, on the city's behalf, every piece of legislation that might touch the square mile's ancient rights, and to remember, which is what the name means, because institutions with privileges this old survive by never once forgetting them. Think about what that job title admits. The two cities still station a professional rememberer on the border between them, 4.5 centuries after the job was invented. And the modern age has added the finest absurdity of all. In the year 2000, London as a whole finally got what the Victorians could never deliver, an elected government for the entire metropolis, the Greater London Authority, headed by a Mayor of London, which means that London now has 2 mayors. The Mayor of London, who governs 8.5 million people from a modern building near Tower Bridge, and the Lord Mayor of London, who presides over the square mile from a Palladian mansion. And they are different people, with different jobs, in different cities, and every few years some newspaper runs a helpful diagram, and every few years the diagram helps nobody, and the confusion itself is the fossil record. English has 2 mayors of London for the same reason it has the words city and city, because there are 2. Even the gate came home. Temple Bar, Wren's actual stone arch, the one the brewer's wife carried off to her Hertfordshire garden in the 1880s, was bought back, every numbered stone of it, and in 2004 it was re-erected in the heart of the square mile, in Paternoster Square beside St Paul's, where it stands tonight, cleaned and pale, a working doorway again after a century and a quarter as the loneliest ornament in England. This city waited 126 years to get its gate back. It had, as ever, no need to hurry. And the pearl sword still lies in its place at Mansion House between duties, and each time a sovereign has entered the city in state, down all the reins since Elizabeth touched it, the carriage or the car has slowed at the Dragon, and the sword has come out, hilt first, and the border has been fed. So now you know everything you need. Every piece is on the table. It is time to keep the promise from the top of the night and say it plainly. Why is London 2 cities pretending to be one? Because they were never one to begin with. That is the spine of it. Roman merchants built a walled trading town at the lowest bridgeable point of the Thames, and 1,000 years later a pious king built his palace and his abbey on a marsh island 2 miles upstream, precisely because he preferred not to live among the merchants, and from that day forward England's money and England's power had separate addresses. That is the first half of the answer. 2 different settlements, born centuries apart for 2 different purposes, money downstream, majesty upstream. And the second half is the reason they never merged, when every other pair of neighbouring towns in history has long since blurred together. They never merged because the City of London successfully made itself too expensive to conquer and too useful to abolish for 1,000 years running. Every ruler who might have crushed it needed to borrow from it instead. William the Conqueror, who broke all England, chartered it in 5 sentences of polite surrender. John, the worst king, handed it an elected mayor and then watched it bankroll Magna Carta, with its own clause and its own mayor among the enforcers. Charles I, the one king who finally called the bluff and demanded obedience inside the walls, watched the gates shut, lost the war that followed, and lost his head in Westminster, the royal city, while the merchant city he never tamed counted the cost of the cannon. Fire could not do it in 1666 because the city turned out to be made of property rights, not timber. The reformers could not do it in 1835 and 1855 and 1889 and 1894 because the city could outweight any commission ever empanelled. So the capital of England did the only thing left. It grew around the stalemate, Westminster kept the crown, the abbey, the parliament, the anointings and the beheadings. The city kept the money, the mayor, the dragons, and the wall it no longer needs. And the vast thing we call London, the London of buses and postcodes, is simply the tide of building that rose around two sovereignties that could not swallow each other, and rose, until only the lawyers and the dragons remembered where the seam ran. Two cities, one name. That is the real reason, whole, and you can carry it now. A city built for trade that refused, politely, relentlessly, for 1,000 years, to be governed by the city built for kings, until pretending to be one city became easier for everyone than admitting they were two. And notice, before we dim the lights, what it was all for, because there is a quiet moral under the strangeness. The city's stubbornness looks like pageantry now, pearls and fur and wicker giants, but the thing it protected over all those centuries was an idea with sharp edges, the idea that power stops at a line, that there can be 1 square mile where the sovereign is a guest, that a king may own the kingdom and still have to slow his carriage at a dragon and be welcomed in. English liberty was not invented in that square mile, but it practiced there, daily, for 1,000 years, like a musician keeping scales alive through the centuries when nobody else was playing. The slammed door of the Commons, the privilege of Parliament, the ancient rule that the Crown asks and does not simply take, all of it learned its manners at Temple Bar. The two cities never did merge, and now they never will. And there is something restful in that, if you sit with it. Most stories run on change. This one ran on refusal. Every century arrived with its irresistible force, its conqueror, its fire, its reforming zeal, its traffic engineers, and the little walled idea by the river said in its politest voice, "No," and the century flowed around it like the tide around a stone and went on its way, and the stone stayed. And if you doubt any of it, if some sensible morning voice in you says surely, by now, this is all just a story historians tell, then I have one last gift for you, the best one, and it is this. You do not need a library to check this story. You need a calendar. Because the treaty between the two cities is not archived. It is performed, on schedule, every year, by real people in real streets, most of whom would tell you, if you asked, that it is just tradition, in the way that a heartbeat is just a habit. So before we sleep, let us spend one quiet year on the border, one full turn of the ceremonial wheel, and watch the oldest peace in England renew itself month by month. This is the wind down now. Nothing bad happens in this part. Nothing bad is allowed to happen in this part. It is all bells and river light from here. Begin in November, because the city's year begins in November, as it has since the Charter of 1215 fixed the mayor-making in the autumn. On a Friday afternoon in Guildhall, the building over the buried Roman amphitheatre, the outgoing Lord Mayor and the incoming one perform what is formally called the silent ceremony. And it is exactly what it says. In front of a packed hall, without a single speech, almost without a word beyond the brief declaration of office, these symbols of the city pass from one pair of hands to the next. The sword, the sceptre, with its head of ancient rock crystal, which tradition holds to be older than the conquest, and which I give you as tradition, not as receipt. The seal, the purse. Each object is presented, bowed over, received. The hats are doffed in a particular order, and then it is done, and the most powerful municipal office on earth has changed hands in near total silence, and the silence is the point, because a thing that has been done 700 times does not need explaining to anyone in the room. Institutions talk when they are nervous. The city has not been nervous since the Middle Ages. The next morning, Saturday, the noise arrives, and it is the noise you already understand because you stood in the rain in 1215 when it was invented. The Lord Mayor's show, the annual journey of the new mayor to swear loyalty to the crown, rolling out of Guildhall Yard behind the pikemen and the bands, 3 miles of procession, thousands of participants, the wicker giants, Gog and Magog, swaying above the crowds as effigies of them have swayed since the 15th century at least, and at the heart of it the state coach, built in 1757, gilded and painted and swaying on its leather braces, several years older than the king's own gold coach, kept the rest of the year in a museum and brought out for this one day, because this is the one day. And here is the detail to fall asleep on. The new Lord Mayor still crosses the line. The oath is sworn these days not at Westminster itself, but before the senior judges at the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand. Because when the courts moved out of Westminster Hall in 1882, the oath simply followed the judges, and the Royal Courts stand just west of the Dragon, a few yards over the boundary on Westminster's side. Look at that. 8 centuries of upheaval. The venue itself picked up and moved, and the one thing that never changed is the crossing. The merchant city's chief still travels out of his own jurisdiction into the crown city to swear, and still comes home before dark. If you ever wanted proof that the border outlives every building on it, there it is, in a coach, every November. Some weeks later, on a date the government of the day chooses, the other city answers with its own great rite, the state opening of Parliament, and you already know its most famous moment, the door of the Commons slammed in Blackrod's face, the 3 knocks, the memory of 1642 performed with straight faces by people in tights. But the state opening carries 2 other habits worth collecting before sleep. Before the sovereign arrives, the yeomen of the guard search the cellars of the Palace of Westminster by lantern light, and they have done so at every state opening since a November night in 1605, when searchers found a tall man in a cloak standing guard over 36 barrels of gunpowder stacked beneath the House of Lords, a soldier named Guy Fawkes, and the kingdom decided permanently that one could not be too careful about cellars, and while the sovereign is at Westminster, a member of Parliament is formally held at Buckingham Palace as a hostage, a leave constitutional pawn, guaranteeing the monarch's safe return from the parliamentary city, a custom descending from centuries when that safety was a genuinely open question. A hostage, in our lifetime, politely drinking tea in a palace drawing room until the crown comes home. The whole relationship of king and capital, preserved like a fly in amber, and the amber is etiquette. Deep winter now, and the wheel turns quietly. In late January or February, in the hall of the goldsmiths' company in the city, a jury is sworn, and it has been sworn every year since at least 1282 for the trial of the Picts, the oldest judicial procedure in continuous operation in England. Its task, then and now, is to test the king's money. Coins from the royal mint, drawn at random through the year, locked in the boxes called pyxes, are counted, weighed, and assayed by the goldsmiths of the city, under the presiding eye of a crown officer called the King's Remembrancer, and months later the jury delivers its verdict on whether the currency of the realm is honest. Sit with that one a moment, in the dark. For more than 700 years the crown has submitted its own coinage to the judgment of the merchants of London. Not the other way around. The city tests the king's money, because the city is where the money has to be believed, and belief was always the square mile's true commodity, from the first silver disc pressed into a Briton's rope-burned palm. Spring, and the light comes back along the river, and on Ascension Day in certain years the choir boys of parishes on the city's eastern edge are led out with long willow wands to beat the bounds, thrashing the old boundary marks so that the line will be remembered in the muscles of the young, the way it was remembered before maps could be trusted. And at the Tower the ceremony has its own edge, because the Tower's Liberty and the neighbouring parish disputed their boundary for centuries, and the beating there is done with a certain historical relish, a border maintained by children hitting it with sticks on the advice of the Middle Ages. It works. It has always worked. The line is remembered. High summer, and the river takes over the calendar, as the river takes over everything in this story eventually. In the third week of July, 6 wooden skiffs row slowly up the Thames flying the flags of the Crown and of 2 city livery companies, the Vintners and the Dyers, on the 5-day census called swan-upping, counting and ringing the year's signets, because the mute swans of the Thames have belonged since the Middle Ages, partly to the sovereign and partly to those 2 companies of London merchants, and every July the Crown Swan marker and the company's uppers work the river together, boat by boat, family by family of hissing birds, sharing the swans the way the 2 cities have shared everything else, formerly feather by feather for 600 years, and in the same month watermen race for Doggett's coat and badge, a sculling race founded in 1715 and contested every single year since, the oldest continuously run rowing race in the world, from London Bridge upstream past both cities to Chelsea, 4 miles and more of tide work, and the winner is dressed in a scarlet coat with a great silver badge on the arm, the costume of the 18th century waterman, the trade of the girl in the orange-lit loft still being rowed, still being won 3 centuries on. And then autumn, and the leaves come down along the embankment, and in October the year performs its masterpiece, the one I have been saving. It is called the Ceremony of Quit Rents. It happens at the Royal Courts of Justice before that same King's Remembrancer, and it is by common consent the oldest legal ceremony in England still performed, saving only the coronation itself, on the books since the year 1211. The City of London appears, in the person of its own senior officers, to pay its annual rent to the Crown for 2 pieces of land. For a piece of moorland in Shropshire, which the city has held since the 13th century, the rent is 2 knives, 1 blunt and 1 sharp, tested solemnly before the court on hazel rods, the blunt one bending over the wood, the sharp one cutting clean, and for a long-vanished forge that once stood near St. Clement Danes, just off the Strand, hard by the border itself, the rent is 6 horseshoes and 61 nails, and they are counted out before the Remembrancer, 6 horseshoes, 61 nails, good number, and here is the touch that should finally convince you that this whole civilization runs on memory dressed as habit. They are the same horseshoes, the identical physical horseshoes, massive medieval things made for war horses, have been rendered in this ceremony year after year for something like 5.5 centuries, solemnly paid to the Crown each October and kept to be paid again, which makes them, as the court officers like to say, the oldest rent in England, eternally owed and eternally returned. Nobody remembers the forge. Nobody has seen the moor. The rent is paid anyway, because the City of London pays what it owes the Crown, to the horseshoe, to the nail, every single year, and in exchange the Crown never asks for more. That is the deal. That was always the deal. 2 knives, 6 horseshoes, 61 nails, and 1,000 years of independence. Cheap at the price. and then it is November again, and a new name is read out in Guildhall, and the hats come off in silence, and the coach rolls, and the wheel has turned once more, as it turned through the Napoleonic Wars and the Blitz, and the plague years and every other interruption the world could devise. And if you have been counting, you will have noticed what all these ceremonies have in common. Every one of them is a border being maintained, crown money tested by city goldsmiths, city rent paid to crown judges, the mayor crossing the line outward, the sovereign crossing it inward, the hostage held, the cellars searched, the bounds beaten, the swans divided. 2 cities, checking the seam between them, gently, annually, the way you run your thumb along an old scar in the dark to make sure it is still quiet. Let me tell you before the last walk what became of the people, because this channel settles its accounts. The real ones first, the documented ones. John Pym, first of the 5 members, the king's great adversary, outlived that January by less than 2 years, dying in December 1643, and Parliament buried him in Westminster Abbey, among the kings, in the royal city, which he would have appreciated, and at the Restoration the returning royalists dug him out again, and reburied him in a common pit in the Abbey yard, which he would also, in a grim way, have understood. Speaker Lenthal, who knelt and said no, lived to old age and asked that his grave bear no monument. Samuel Pepys, who wept at the fire from his boat, kept his diary for 9 years, and his secrets for 3 centuries, and sleeps in a city church, St. Olave's, the one he called our own church, beside his wife. Christopher Wren, who lost the battle for his ideal city and won the skyline instead, died in 1723 at 90, and lies in the crypt of his own cathedral under the plainest tomb in it, with the Latin epitaph his son composed, "Reader, if you seek his monument, look around you." And Thomas Bloodworth, the Lord Mayor of the Pissit-out, served out his year, and retired into an obscurity that history has refused, ever since, to fully grant him. And the borrowed eyes, the boatman with his rope-torn knuckles, the fisherman with his eels, the mason with his split hands, the apprentice with his torch in the rain, the glover's man with his numb feet, the stationer's boy with his ink-stained fingers, the waterman's daughter in the orange-lit loft, the lamplighter in the fog, the analyst with her cooling coffee. You know the deal we made at the start of the night. They were never any one person, and so they get no gravestones from me, and I will not pretend to know what became of them. Whoever they each really were, all the thousands of them that these few stood in for, the 2 cities closed over their lives the way the river closes over rain, and what they saw became what we know, and that is the only afterlife a witness needs. There remain the small questions, the ones that arrive in the comments at 2 in the morning, from people who are definitely, certainly almost asleep, and this is the hour for them, because they all have soft answers, and every answer turns out to be the same answer wearing different clothes. Is Buckingham Palace in the City of London, someone always asks? No. Buckingham Palace is in the city of Westminster, as it must be, as everything royal must be, and it only became the monarch's principal home in 1837, when the young Victoria moved in, which makes the palace, by the standards of this story, practically a new build, a teenager among the institutions. The King of England has never had his principal home inside the City of London, not once, not for a single reign in 1,000 years, and by now you know that this is not an oversight. It is the whole architecture of the piece. Then where is the Tower of London, asks someone else. Surely that is the King's castle in the city. And here is the quiet punchline waiting inside the map. The tower is not in the city. Go and look at the boundary. The line runs along the western edge of the tower's ditch, and the fortress itself sits just outside it, in its own ancient liberty, in the modern borough of Tower Hamlets, pressed against the city's wall from without, exactly where William planted it in 1078. And now you can say in one sentence what 9 centuries of constitutional law have been too polite to put so plainly. The king's castle was built to watch the city, and the city drew its boundary so that the castle would never be inside it. The two of them have stood there ever since, wall against wall, like two old men on adjoining balconies who have long since stopped mentioning the reason. "What about south of the river?" asks a third voice, getting drowsier. "What about Southwark, the Bridgefoot, the Borough?" And Southwark is the story's almost child, the third city that never quite was. For centuries it was the city's unruly doorstep, the land at the southern end of the bridge, home to the theatres and the bear pits and the prisons, everything the city licensed but did not want inside the walls. Shakespeare's Globe stood there for exactly that reason, and in 1550 the city finally bought royal rights over part of it, and named it, with a shrug you can still hear in the words, the ward of bridge without. The ward beyond the bridge, it never got a corporation, never got a charter of its own, and today it is simply a London borough like the other 31, which is the fate the City of London spent 1,000 years declining. And if you want to know what the square mile would have become without its wall of parchment, the answer is there across the water, somewhere ordinary, somewhere absorbed. Who actually lives in the square mile now, someone murmurs. Almost nobody, and that is one of the strangest facts of all. Around 8,000 or 9,000 residents, in a district where the medieval city packed in 80,000, and into which, every working morning, more than 500,000 people pour over the bridges and out of the stations, and out of which every evening they drain away again. Think about what that means. The city has become tidal, the one thing it was built beside, the thing that made it, the rise and fall of water twice a day, has become the shape of its own population, a flood tide of humanity at 9, an ebb at 6, and by 10 at night the streets that govern the money of the world are as empty as they were in the dark earth centuries, and the wren churches stand locked among the towers with congregations of office workers who exist only at lunchtime. The city is nearly uninhabited, and busier than anywhere in Britain. Both at once, tied in, tied out, and because the residents are so few and the workers so many, the city's elections work like nowhere else in the country, and I will give this to you straight, with the honesty marker attached, because it is genuinely contested ground. In the square mile, businesses vote. Firms and partnerships appoint voters in numbers scaled to their workforce, alongside the handful of actual residents. And this business franchise is unique in British democracy, defended by the corporation as the only fair way to govern a place where the daytime population outnumbers the nighttime 160 to 1, and attacked by critics for as long as anyone can remember as a medieval anomaly that ought to have gone the way of the rotten boroughs. Both sides are describing the same fact. The city is not governed like the rest of Britain. It never has been. The critics call that the scandal, and the corporation calls it the point, and this argument itself, gentle listener, is now several centuries old and shows every sign of comfortably outliving us all, like everything else within the dragons. And why, asks the last voice, barely awake now, do the newsreaders say the city when they mean money? The city reacted, the city expects, the way Americans say Wall Street. And that is the loveliest small answer of all, because it means the whole of this story is hiding inside ordinary grammar. When a London newsreader says the city, with that capital letter you can somehow hear, and means not 8 million people but 1 square mile of banks, she is using the name exactly as William's clerks used it in 1067, exactly as the Charter of 1215 used it, meaning the old walled thing, the merchant sovereignty, the London that is not the same as London. The distinction you have spent this whole night learning is spoken aloud, correctly, every single day, by millions of people who have no idea they're making it. The border survives in the language like the wall survives in the street plan. Nobody remembers, and nothing is forgotten. So the small questions are done, and they were all one question, and you know the answer now and the night is late, so come with me to the eastern edge for a moment, because there is a thing that happens out there every single night at exactly the same minute, and I've been saving it for nearly the end. Picture the square mile at 9 in the evening. The tide of workers has long since ebbed. The towers stand lit and empty, humming to themselves, running their software through the small hours the way the monks of Thorney once ran their night offices, and the streets are down to their last few figures. A security guard in a bright doorway, a cleaner's trolley clicking over the pavement, a fox, descendant of the wall's old foxes, trotting down the exact centre of a street that was a Roman road, with the calm of an owner. The gulls have gone to their roosts on the river. The dragons stand at their crossings with the streetlight sliding off their wings, and at the eastern boundary, just beyond the line, floodlit above its dry moat, the tower waits for its own bedtime, because the tower has had the same bedtime for roughly 700 years. At exactly 7 minutes to 10, every night without exception, a warder of the tower in a scarlet and black coat comes out carrying a lantern with a single candle burning in it, and a ring of keys, and with an escort of soldiers he walks the outer gates of the fortress and locks them, one by one, the great oak leaves swinging shut, the locks turning with the sound like a full stop, and as he returns through the dark towards the innermost gate, a sentry steps out and challenges him, and the exchange that follows has not changed in its bones since the Middle Ages. Halt! Who comes there? The keys. Whose keys? King Charles's keys. Pass, King Charles's keys, and all's well. And the keys are carried in, and a bugle sounds last post into the cold air over the empty wharves, and the Tower of London is locked until morning. They call it the Ceremony of the Keys, and it has been performed every night, every single night for about 7 centuries, through plague, through fire, through both world wars, and on the night of the 29th of December 1940, the night the bombs made the second Great Fire, blast from a falling stick of incendiaries knocked the escort and the warder off their feet mid-ceremony, and they got up, brushed themselves down and finished locking up, a few minutes late, and the officer of the guard wrote to the king to apologise for the delay, and the king's office wrote back that the delay was acceptable, since the cause was enemy action. The ceremony was late once in 700 years, and there is paperwork for it. Why am I ending here, at a fortress that is not even in the city, at a ceremony that belongs to the crown and not the merchants? Because listen to what that little ritual actually says every night at the seam between the two cities. The king's own castle, the one built to overawe London, locks itself in at 10 o'clock. The instrument of royal power over the city ends every day of its existence by carefully, formally, ceremonially shutting itself behind its own gates and posting a guard, while the unwalled, unarmed, ungoverned by anyone else square mile sleeps open to the night air 50 yards away, protected by nothing but a few bronze dragons and the accumulated habit of a millennium. The fortress locks up. The city doesn't need to. If you want the entire 1,000-year negotiation in a single image, it is that lantern with its one candle, moving along the wall in the dark, locking the king in. All's well. Now come and walk the line once more, slowly tonight in the dark, because the border is at its best at night, and this is the last thing we will do. Start on the Westminster side by the abbey, floodlit honey-coloured stone against a blue-black sky, on the island that no longer looks like an island, though the Tyburn still runs beneath the streets in a pipe, a buried river obeying its old bed under the traffic. The abbey holds its kings the way it has since the January week when it buried one and crowned another before the mortar was dry. Big Ben strikes somewhere above you, and the sound rolls east, over the courts, over the last-lit windows of the government offices, out along the river the way every important thing in this story has always travelled, by water, downstream, toward the money. Follow it, up Whitehall, past the banqueting house, where a window once opened onto a scaffold on a cold January afternoon, the coldest afternoon of the whole tale, and the street is quiet now, just the late buses sighing past the guards, into Trafalgar Square, where the last Aldwych of the Saxons lies somewhere under your feet, the beach city, the middle sibling nobody remembers, and then the Strand, the ancient hedge-betting street, the 2-mile negotiation, its grand hotels dimmed to night lighting, and you can feel the ground doing what it has done for 1,000 years, sloping gently, socially, commercially, from the city of power toward the city of money. And then the Dragon, mid-road, wings up, black and silver under the street lamps, at the spot where the chain hung, where the bar stood, where the heads look down, where Elizabeth took the sword and handed it back, where the coaches of 8 centuries of monarchs slowed and stopped and waited in the world's longest-running performance of an idea. There is no gate anymore. There is no wall anymore. There is a statue of a border, and the border is the realest thing on the street. Stand beside it a moment. Traffic light, gull cry, the cold coming up off the pavement into your shoes. On this side of the Dragon, Westminster, the Crown City. One step, and you're in the City of London, the Merchant City, the Lord Mayor's City, the unconquered square mile, and absolutely nothing visible changes, and absolutely everything underneath does. It is the quietest border crossing on earth. You have made it tonight, in your mind, and that is the whole pilgrimage. And since you've come this far, take the last mile too, because the walk is not finished until it reaches the water. Go on, eastward, into the sleeping square mile. Fleet Street first, the old street of the printers, silent now, its presses long moved away, and under your feet, in a pipe like the Tyburn's, runs the buried River Fleet. The stream that once marked the city's western approaches, still flowing down there in the dark, still emptying into the Thames under Blackfriars Bridge, a river demoted to a secret. Then the little rise the Romans knew, Ludgate Hill, and the great west front of St. Paul's opens above you, floodlit, enormous, quiet, the dome hanging over the empty streets like a second moon, and in the paved square beside it, pale and clean under the lamps, stands Temple Bar, the actual gate, home from its sentry in the garden, and you can walk through Wren's archway at midnight with nobody watching, out of nothing into nothing, through a doorway that once divided everything from everything. Cheapside next, the widest street of the medieval city, where the mercer's shop stood, where the torch boy watched the charter read in the rain, where the chant rose around a king's coach on a January afternoon, and it is only a shopping street now, dark glass and sale signs, and it takes a working effort of the mind to hear the chanting under the silence, but you can do it, tonight of all nights, because you are there. Then a left turn into the courtyard of Guildhall, still the seat of the corporation after more than 800 years of continuous business on this spot, the amphitheatre sleeping under its paving, the hall where the Common Council said no to an anointed king waiting calmly for its next agenda, and then on past Bank Junction, where the Lord Mayor's mansion, the Bank of England, and the Royal Exchange face each other across the emptiness like three players holding their cards, and down any of the little falling lanes toward the river, lanes with names like Ship's Biscuits, until you come out on the cold open air of the waterfront, and there it is. The Thames at night, wide and black and folded with lights, running seaward on the ebb, past the dark piers of the bridges, past the site, a few yards from where you stand, where a timber bridge once crossed, and a town was born because the tide came this far and no farther. Stand there 1 minute. The river does not remember the Romans, or the Confessor, or the Charters, or the fire, or you. The river is the only character in this story that never signed anything, and it is the reason for every signature. 2 cities grew on its bank because of what its water would carry and where its tides would turn, and when both cities have worn away to a red layer in some future clay, the water will still be doing exactly this, sliding down to the sea in the dark, twice a day, for nobody. And here the story stops moving forward, because it has caught up with you, lying in the dark, wherever you are, listening to the end of 1,000 years. So let it stop. No more dates now. The dates are done. You can let them go, one by one, the way the tide lets go the bridge piles, gently, without argument. 50 and 886 and 1066 and 12, 15 and 1642 and 1666, let them sink back down into the dark earth layer where the centuries keep their ash, safe under the floors of the sleeping banks. You do not need to hold them anymore. You know the shape now, and the shape is enough. 2 cities, 1 name, a dragon at the seam. Think how much sleeping that ground has seen. The Briton slept by his fire with his rope-burned hands curled shut, and the tide came in and went out. The monks of Thorney slept their scheduled sleep between the night offices, and the eel traps swayed in the current, and the tide came in and went out. The mason slept, the apprentice slept, the waterman's daughter finally slept 2 nights after the fire in a field north of the wall, under a borrowed blanket with the smell of smoke in her hair, and even she slept in the end, because everyone does, because the body always wins that negotiation no matter what burned. The whole vast city is doing it now. This minute, 8.5 million people in the rings of brick around the 2 old hearts, breathing slow, and the square mile itself sleeps hardest of all, nearly empty every night. A few thousand residents rattling around a district built for 500,000, the towers dark, the trading floors silent, the dragons standing their watch over streets with nobody on them. The oldest city in the story is also its best sleeper. Let that be your model tonight. Centuries will pass as they have passed. The London you know will change beyond recognition, as it has changed beyond recognition 8 or 9 times already in this one story. The towers of glass will come down as the basilica came down, as the gates came down, and something not yet imagined will stand in the rubble layers above them. The river will still slide past both cities, twice a day in, twice a day out, patient as arithmetic, and people will still cross the invisible line without knowing it, still stop now and then at a boundary older than every government on earth, still hand something precious back and forth, hilt first to say, I could keep this, and I choose not to, which is the oldest piece there is. Some things do not change, the tide does not change, the bargain does not change, and you have done your part of the night's work. You followed the whole line, from the bleeding knuckles to the pearl sword, and you can explain it now, tomorrow, to anyone who asks in a minute flat, and they will look at you the way the crowd looked at the man reading the charter in the rain. But that is tomorrow. Tomorrow there will be time enough for explaining. Tomorrow there will be borders to cross and oaths to keep, and small stubborn liberties to defend by being politely immovable, the way the old city taught you tonight. Tomorrow can have all of that. Tomorrow is not your concern. Right now you are warm enough, safe enough, tired enough. You have a roof and a bed, and the whole slow weight of a story settling over you like deep water over old stone, and that is more than most of the people in this tale had on their best night, and it is enough. It is enough. It is enough. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way the tide takes the river, without hurry, without asking. Let the two cities blur back into one, the way they look from the air at night. One carpet of light with the seam only the dragons remember. Let the dates sink. Let the bells fade. Westminster's first, then the cities, farther off, softer, the way sound carries over water and then doesn't. Let your thoughts slow and soften and settle, like ash after a great fire, like silt in the pilings of an old bridge, like snow on a garden in Hertfordshire, where a stone gate stood for 100 years, waiting patiently to go home. You do not have to guard any borders tonight. The dragons have the watch. They are very good at it. They have never once in all this time let the wrong thing through. Sleep now, citizen. You are inside the walls. Good night.